Hi, everyone. My name is Susan Whalen. I'm a Connecticut Audubon Board member and former Deputy Commissioner for Environmental Conservation at the Connecticut Department of Energy and Environmental Protection. I would like to welcome everyone to Young, Gifted, and Wild About Birds. Tonight is the second of 6 in a series we are offering, which features presentations by younger generation conservationists, scientists, and ornithologists carrying out newsworthy and innovative work. Before I introduce tonight's speaker, a few housekeeping items. We'll record the presentation and make the recording available if you want to watch again. Everyone will be muted throughout the presentation. We have almost 100 guests this evening, and remaining on mute will help to prevent background noise. We recommend that you use speaker view for the best presentation experience. You can select that view in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. Use the chat function to ask questions. We'll answer them at the end. You should be seeing captions transcribing this presentation. If you prefer not to view them, select Hide Captions on the control bar. Finally, a note of thanks to Planet Fuel Charitable Foundation for sponsoring Young, Gifted, and Wild About Birds. And now I'm delighted to introduce tonight's speaker, Eliza Grahams. Eliza is a PhD candidate in ecology and evolutionary biology at the University of Connecticut. She's working with a team of researchers on a project focused on ovenbirds that might help keep the population of this iconic bird from declining. She's recording their songs and trying to determine why some males sing later into the summer than others. Eliza is also studying why small forest fragments are less densely populated with songbirds than larger fragments. What she's discovered through modeling and song analysis may have important implications for the conservation of ovenbirds. Thank you, Eliza, for your work. And to everyone watching tonight, we hope you enjoy the presentation.
Great. Thanks, Susan, for that introduction. And thanks to everyone at Connecticut Audubon for putting on this series and for inviting me to be part of it. I'm really excited to be here tonight talking about my dissertation research. So as Susan said, I am in the 5th and final year of my PhD studying ovenbirds, but I want to back up a little bit before I jump into all of that research and just tell you guys about how I got to where I am and why I do what I do. So this place, as you'll notice, is not a forest, which is where you would find ovenbirds. So this is the place where I really got interested in birds in the first place. And this is the Minnesota Valley National Wildlife Refuge in Minnesota, which is where I call home. And this is on the lands of the Wapakudi Nation. And I really got interested in birds at this place. Now, my mom, who's on the call tonight, would probably tell you that, no, I've always been interested in birds ever since I was a little girl and we had the bluebird boxes up. But really, I don't actually remember a whole lot about the bluebird boxes. But it was enough to spark my interest in birds to get me to take an ornithology class at the University of Minnesota while I was there for undergrad. And while I was taking ornithology as an elective with Bob Zink and Hernan Vasquez Miranda, they gave us—
Eliza, the slides aren't advancing.
Oh. Which slide are you on?
We're still on the first slide, and we see your, it's not in presentation view.
Oh, okay.
You have dual monitors? If you have dual monitors, perhaps it's showing the wrong monitor.
It is. Okay. Now are you seeing different?
Yes.
Yes.
slides?
Yes.
Okay, thank you for letting me know. So this is still the refuge. You all missed the adorable photo of me with the bluebird boxes. But yeah, so it got me to take ornithology though. And when I was taking ornithology, one of our final class projects was to go out and observe red-winged blackbirds. And so the assignment was to go and find red-winged blackbirds and then record observations on their songs and their displays. So their little red shoulders are called epaulettes, and the males will, put them up in their little aggressive displays. And so the assignment was to go out and record this behavior and make observations of it. And I was a communications major, but I was like, I can do this. I can go, I can find a blackbird and I can observe what they're doing. It's gonna be great. And then Hernan says, no, actually you need to find a lot of blackbirds. blackbirds. I think the requirement was we had to have at least 7 and preferably more than 11 male blackbirds all in the same marsh. And I was thinking, I was like, okay, that's a little bit more challenging, but I'm sure I can still figure it out. And then he says, and you have to complete all of your observations before 8 a.m., which essentially means you need to be out there at dawn to get started. And I was like, okay, that's still doable, I think, except for keep in mind that I wasn't in Eastern Connecticut where it might be much easier to find that many male blackbirds. I was in Minneapolis because that's where the University of Minnesota is. And so this is what the habitat around me looked like. And this is not the kind of place that it's going to be easy to go and find at least 7, preferably more, male blackbirds all singing and displaying at like 6 a.m. And so I was trying to figure this out. And of course, there's the added challenge that I was a student and didn't have a car. But luckily there was good public transportation in Minneapolis. And so I could take the light rail, which goes to the Mall of America. And the stop right before the Mall of America was the Minnesota Valley National Wildlife Refuge. This might sound familiar to you if you were in the call last month to hear about Deja Perkins' work, because she also got started interested in birds at the same place, which I thought was kind of an odd coincidence when I learned about that. But I was able to go out, take the first light rail in the morning, get down to the marsh and observe the red-winged blackbirds. And that's really where I just got really interested in birds, because it wasn't about trying to find them and catalog them and list as many birds as I could find. It was all about just observing their behavior to try to understand it better. And that was really just fascinating to me. And so I got really interested in birding. It started to be that, you couldn't take a picture of me without binoculars on. So, there's this gorgeous scenery and I just wanted to look at the birds. It's like, yeah, Golden Gate Bridge, that's cool and all, but have you seen these ducks? Became a little bit of a problem, family vacations. I wasn't too aware of what was going on with my family because there were some cool birds that I wanted to look at. And so that kind of hinted to me that maybe I didn't really want to work in communications. I wanted to work with birds. So I started volunteering at Hawk Ridge Bird Observatory in Duluth, Minnesota, where I was helping out with some of the marketing and merchandising and things like that. So I helped them design shirts. Then I started volunteering in their outreach and public education. I got involved banding raptors. So this here is a kestrel that I got to band, and I just want to point out just how cute baby kestrel chicks are because they are really cute. And so all of this was just great. I was so excited to be working with birds all the time. And of course, I kept going out still on birding trips and just looking at birds, especially a lot with my mom. But even when we were in these, really amazing places like the Saxon Bog, where a lot of people go to try to see lifers, birds that they haven't seen ever before in their life, I still just wanted to watch the behavior. It doesn't matter to me, that it's a great gray owl or northern hawk owl or some very rare bird. I just want to watch the behavior and see what they're doing. And so that kind of hinted to me, maybe I should go to grad school for this and really take this kind of hobby more seriously. And so that's what I did. There's that little song of the ovenbird because that's what the talk's all about. So this is the study species that I work with for my dissertation. It is an ovenbird. They're little warblers that are pretty common in forest fragments in most of North America. So that song is probably familiar to a lot of you, even if you didn't know that it was an ovenbird who makes that, teacher, teacher, teacher call. And I say that because they're really widely distributed. So they breed across most of the Midwest and Eastern United States, and you can find them all year round. Well, not all year round necessarily, but they're in North America all year round. They winter in Central America and the Caribbean, and then they're quite widely distributed in breeding and migration. And within Connecticut, they're also really widely distributed. So the Connecticut Bird Atlas is an ongoing community science project where there's a group of researchers, including my advisor at the University of Connecticut, who are coordinating this effort to go out and survey every part of Connecticut to figure out which birds are there during the breeding season and which ones are there in the wintering season, so we know where the birds are and can use that information to prioritize conservation planning. So what they've done is they've broken the state up into blocks. So each of these little squares is one atlas block, and each atlas block, people go out, they volunteer or just go out birding and then send in their information so we know where birds are in Connecticut. And ovenbirds have been found in almost, I think it's like 75% of the blocks so far. And for a lot of those blocks, especially the ones in like Eastern Connecticut that don't have any marked, I don't think it's because they're not there. It's just that we don't have data from those blocks yet. So they're really widely distributed. Their chances are good that they're in most parts of the state, maybe not down in Fairfield County because it's pretty urban, but everywhere else, very good chance that there's ovenbirds there. We also know that they're not just commonly distributed, they're also locally abundant. And so what I mean by that is that where there are ovenbirds, there's usually a lot of ovenbirds if you're in good habitat for them. So the map showing here is the work of Dr. Valerie Steen, who is a former postdoc at the University of Connecticut. And she was using bird observations from eBird and from the North American Breeding Bird Survey to figure out where you would expect to see all of the birds that occur in Connecticut and how many of them. And so in the map, the lighter colors mean that there's not as many ovenbirds there probably, and the darker colors mean there's probably a lot of ovenbirds there. And some of you can probably guess what this association is and what this really map is mostly a map of. I mean, obviously it's a map of where there's probably a lot of ovenbirds, but it's also sort of a map of where there's forest in Connecticut. So this whole section in the middle, that's pretty developed, it's kind of that urban corridor, but up in the northwest corner and then most of Eastern Connecticut, it's primarily just forest. And that is the type of habitat that ovenbirds really like. So this is, could be any forest in Eastern Connecticut really that you walk into. And this is the kind of habitat that ovenbirds really like. They really like big trees, a decent amount of understory vegetation, and being far from the edges of forest. And we do know though that the amount of forest area in Connecticut has decreased by about 16% from 1985 to 2006, and that it's continued decreasing since then. So this is an aerial image of the area around Norwich, Connecticut. You can kind of see this is the river and then town is here. And so this is in 1985. The pixels in black are forest, and then white is everything else. So that could be housing, it could be roads, it could be a park or grass or farm field. It's just anything that's not forest. And then this is the same area in 2015. So I'll flip back and forth between them a couple times because that's the easiest way I think to look at these maps and interpret them, is to just see how much white appears or how much the black, which is the forest, disappears. And you can see some areas, it looks like there's whole new little developments that have gone in. And then other areas, it's more just a general expansion of the white area. So with less forest in Connecticut, we might be a bit concerned about birds that require forest for breeding. So I've been working with a group of researchers at the University of Connecticut and Wesleyan University on this study of birds, caterpillars, deer, other mammals, plants. I think that's everything. So we're looking at trophic interactions, which means basically up the food web and down the food web. So what's available for ovenbirds to eat, what might eat ovenbirds, and I should say not just ovenbirds, there's like 80 some species of birds that we've been studying. And we've been going out and doing point counts. So we go into the woods and count all of the birds you can hear within a 8-minute time frame. and doing a whole lot of data collection and sampling. So I've been working as part of that broader project as a framework. And from that, I'm just interested in the data that relates to ovenbirds. And we're able to use the results of counting and listening to all the birds to estimate where they are, how many there are, and what types of features in the landscape make an area especially good or bad if you're an ovenbird. And I really enjoy this figure. So I'll just orient you here. So the y-axis here is frequency. So this is the number of sites out of 218 where there was, and then the x-axis is the probability of occupancy, which is basically what is the chance or the probability that there is an ovenbird present. So it doesn't matter if there's one ovenbird or 20 ovenbirds, just whether or not you would expect that there's an ovenbird there. And I say I really like this graph because it just made me laugh as soon as I looked at it, because we were only sampling in forests and the low end of the graph is like 99.5. So essentially what this figure is telling us is that if you go into the woods anywhere in Eastern Connecticut, there's over like a 99.5% chance that there's an ovenbird somewhere within a couple hundred meters of you, even if you don't see it or hear it. So that was informative. We kind of just concluded that there are ovenbirds basically everywhere. But where it gets more interesting is when you look at how many ovenbirds there are. So these are our counts of how many ovenbirds we saw at, or heard or saw or counted at any of the sites. And so the average here is about, 3.5 or 4. So within a couple 100-meter radius, if you're in the woods in Eastern Connecticut, there's probably 3 or 4 ovenbirds within a couple 100 meters of you. So that's interesting. It gives us a good picture of, they really are widely distributed and locally pretty abundant compared to other birds. But that isn't the most interesting thing to do research-wise, because I want to know, what are the differences and how can we actually make conservation decisions based on this? So if we look at the same count data across forest sites, and I should say most of our sites are on the lands of the Mohican, Mashantucket, Pequot, Nipmuc, and Podunk nations. And so we went out into these 32 different forests, and within each we went to 7 different points within the forest and counted the ovenbirds. And there's a lot of variability. So the y-axis here is the mean abundance. So that's just basically how many birds did we count there. And then each box represents a different site. And so some of them you can see, like this one, this is up in Willington, Connecticut. There's a lot of ovenbirds there. So consistently at each spot that we went to in this forest, there was a lot of ovenbirds. And then other sites, there's almost none. So in this one, it looks like there was 1 ovenbird at one site, and then 6 spots in this forest, there was just no ovenbirds. And so that makes me, want to ask questions like, well, what's so good about this forest that's not good about this one? Because we know that there are forests in Eastern Connecticut, so there should be ovenbirds there, but there's different numbers. And one of the really nice things about ovenbirds and why I started studying them in the first place is that there's been a lot of research done on them. So, 30 or 40 years of scientific studies from all across Eastern North America, where people have looked at different reasons why we see this type of pattern. And so that's where I get to have a lot of fun and dig into the literature. And this is a reasonably accurate portrayal of what it looks like to be a PhD student digging through the scientific literature to come up with hypotheses and do research. So I get, all of the papers that people have published and all the scientific studies, and then I'm like drawing little red yarn between everything until I feel like I'm developing a conspiracy theory, essentially, about what makes some forests better habitat for ovenbirds based on what everybody else before me has studied. And so I want to walk through the less crazy looking version of that model. So essentially, we know that forest size has a lot to do with the population size of ovenbirds, or how many ovenbirds you would expect in the same area of a forest. And there's a lot of different things that might affect the density of the population. But one of the things that's been studied most in the scientific literature is reproductive success. So essentially, how many offspring will you have? How many chicks are you going to have fledge out of your nest? And are your offspring successful? And so we know that forest size affects reproductive success, but there's got to be some link. You know, you can't just all of a sudden have different reproductive success in forests of different size. There's got to be something that causes that. And one of the things that a lot of people have looked at is how forest size changes how many mammals are present in the forest, which then changes the rates of nest predation for ovenbirds. Another thing that people have looked at a lot is how forest size changes the abundance of brown-headed cowbirds, because they're brood parasites, which I'll get into more in a bit. And that also affects ovenbird reproductive success. And then a third one that's received less attention from researchers, but is something that a lot of people are looking into now, is how forest size changes how many insects and other invertebrates are available as food, which could change reproductive success. If you don't have enough food for your offspring, they're probably not going to make it. So this is the simple, or I shouldn't say simple, it's the simplified version of the big crazy conspiracy theory web of how all of these different processes might interact to make forest size lead to different ovenbird population sizes. And so for my dissertation, we've been going out and collecting data on all of these different factors. But one of the hardest things is, in order to be able to measure reproductive success, you have to find the ovenbird nests. So I've got a poll question in here to see if anyone here tonight has ever found an ovenbird nest. And so the options I put in here are yes, and if you have, please tell me about it in the chat. I want to hear all about it. That you might have, but it could have really just been a convincing pile of leaves. If you're not sure, or if you know, you've definitely never found an ovenbird nest. Okay, so it looks like some people have found ovenbird nests. If you want to tell me in the chat, that would be great. I will probably add how you found it to the protocol. But most people have not found an ovenbird nest. Oh, okay, Patrick saw when he worked at Bend to the River. Yeah, I think if you're out in the woods a lot, especially if you're not on a trail, you've probably run into them before. Okay, so for those of you who aren't sure, or you've never seen one, you're in good company, because this is a picture of a former undergrad who was working on the project, Amanda Minicucci. And if you're wondering why she's so pleased with herself here, it's because she found an ovenbird nest, which might not be that obvious from looking at this picture. So the nest is right there in the white circle. So they're really, really hard to find because they really do just look like convincing piles of leaves in most cases. For example, there's another nest in this picture. I'm not just showing you pictures of the ground. I swear there's a nest in here. The main area of the nest is in that circle, and then the nest entrance is right there. So even if you're right next to one of them, it can be pretty hard to find them. Here's another one just for good measure, and it's got a couple ovenbird chicks in it. So I still kind of am amazed that we were able to find as many nests as we did to be able to do some of this research. The number one way that we found nests, I will say, is I almost stepped on them. I think we added it up at one point, and it was about 75% of the nests were found by not actually stepping on them, but stepping very near. Looks like other people have found them, yep, on slopes of ponds. Some people have confirmed them breeding because they are so common. You can see them like carrying food, but finding the nests is really hard. Most of them is just luck. Yeah. So once we found the nest, though, we're able to go out and collect the data that we're looking for. So the first hypothesis that we were working on is looking at mammals and how mammal communities change in response to forest size, and then how that affects predation. And so to measure the mammal activity and mammal abundance in all of our different forest sites, we put out camera traps. So this is two former undergraduate students who worked on the project, Rob Lepore and Ben Ranelli, and they're putting up a camera trap to measure the number of mammals that are around. And these are the same kind of camera traps that you would put out if you had like a trail camera in your backyard to see what was wandering through, or like a lot of hunters use them to be able to figure out where the deer are in the woods. So we put these cameras out at random spots within the forest sites so that we could figure out what the, how many mammals there were and how active they were. And then we also put them right near each nest site, so about 15 feet away, pointed at the nest, so that we could see who was visiting the nests. So, which also means every time we went to check on a nest, we got really great photos of field work. So this is, I included this one because that means that there's a nest right here. So I'm checking the nest. And then I think this is one day later from the exact same camera trap, we got 2 off-leash dogs who are walking, the nest is right here. So they're really close to it. And then even some off-leash cats came through that site, so right next to the nest. So we were able to capture nest predators near the nests, and not just domestic ones, but all sorts of nest predators. The other thing that we want to do is be able to figure out exactly when a nest was, well, depredated, which is a fancy word to say when it was eaten. And because sometimes we would come to a nest like this and we know that this nest was not successful because there's feathers all around it. This one, we couldn't put a camera looking directly at the nest because it was in so many ferns. But we were able to find a raccoon near here at the time the nest was depredated. And we know the exact time within 3 minutes, thanks to these fancy little eye buttons, which they are temperature loggers. The main use that I've found for them when Googling it is to be shipped with frozen French fries and other frozen foods to make sure that they stay in food safe temperature ranges the entire time they're shipped, so that you know that they're safe to eat. But they're good for also putting inside nests to track the exact temperature because they're so specific to be able to tell, if the food has thawed out or not. So this is a nest into which we've put one of the eye buttons. It's right here, so it's just kind of nestled in there with the eggs. A lot of people ask if that bothers the ovenbirds at all. And the shorter answer is nope, they don't seem to notice, except for this one female ovenbird who every single time we put an eye button into her nest, she would carry it like 10 feet away. She had like a little eye button graveyard, which we didn't find for a while. We just couldn't figure out where all the eye buttons were. And every time we put one in, she would take it a couple feet away and put it in the exact same spot until we found like 4 of them there. But anyways, for the most part, they don't notice that they're actually in the nest and it doesn't disturb them at all or change their behavior. And what we get from the eye buttons is a series of temperature. So in this graph, the y-axis here is the temperature in Celsius, and the x-axis is kind of an arbitrary time measurement where each point is 3 minutes. And this can actually tell us a lot about what's going on at the nest from just knowing the internal temperature. For example, these stars are all indicating the same time of day, you might have noticed them and picked up on this pattern that there's a lot of up and downs in the temperature, but kind of always getting up to the same high point, and then a steady period of temperature, and then the temperature drops, and then it goes up and down again, and then stays steady, and then it drops, and then it goes up and down, stays steady, and drops. So I want to ask you guys another poll question to see if you can figure out what's going on with the temperature here. And just see if you guys can figure out what time of day you think this is. Okay, it looks like most people have figured it out. So those of you who said just before sunrise, that is correct. It seems kind of counterintuitive at first to think that that's the coldest part. So it's not actually the coldest part of the night. Oops, I went forward. It is, yeah, it's just before sunrise, because this extended warm period is nighttime when the female's incubating all night to make sure that the eggs stay warm. But then of course, when she's been in the nest all night, and it's been a while since she's eaten, and so the first thing she does in the morning is leaves the nest to go forage, but it's still pretty cold outside, so that's why the temperature drops quite a ways. And then this up and down throughout the day is when she'll incubate and then leave to go and forage to feed herself, then go back. So it's back and forth all day, and then on the nest all night. So it's just really cool that we can get that type of data just from knowing the temperature. We know exactly how much time she's spending with the eggs and not with them. We can also figure out when the chicks leave the nest because the temperature changes, because once there's chicks in the nest, they keep it warm. And if the temperature cuts off all of a sudden and goes into this kind of rolling motion, which just means it's tracking the outside temperature, that means that the nest has been depredated. So that's how we can figure out the exact time of day within 3 minutes that a nest was depredated. So for example, we use that type of information for this nest, which was the time suggested that it was at like sometime in the middle of the night, the nest had been depredated. And so we went through the camera trap pictures for that window of time, and we found this barred owl near the nest right around when we knew the chicks had been eaten. So it helped us figure out, we solved the mystery of what happened to this nest. And then we also put some button quail eggs into the nest so that we could figure out who exactly was going at the nest when we couldn't actually identify like a large mammalian predator. So once a nest had been depredated, or in some fake nests, we put these quail eggs. So I wanted to ask you guys, what do you think caused the scratches on this egg? When I put some of the common nest predators that we get there, so blue jays, cat, mouse, snakes, and raccoons. Okay, yeah, it looks like we've got an even split of guesses here between raccoon and mouse. I did tell you earlier that raccoons do get a lot of the nests, and they do. But this one, we have a picture of the culprit. So this was the egg put in there, and here's the culprit. It's a little mouse. We don't know what species of mouse because it's really hard to tell from the camera trap pictures. And the nest that it got the fake egg out of was right here. So we're able to use the pictures to get the behavior even after a nest has already failed, just so that we know who the predators are. Okay, so I want to move on now to talking about brown-headed cowbirds in brood parasitism, which is one of the coolest parts of my research, I think. So brown-headed cowbirds are, this is a female brown-headed cowbird here, they have this really cool reproductive strategy where instead of going to the bother of, making a nest and laying your eggs, incubating them, then once they hatch, you gotta feed them and take care of them. Instead, they just lay their eggs in other birds' nests, which is really efficient because lay eggs in a lot of different bird nests, and you kind of just hope that some of those nests are going to be successful. So it's like the exact opposite of putting all your eggs in one basket, I suppose. And so this is a great reproductive strategy for the cowbirds. And the way that it isn't as good for ovenbirds is that then the ovenbirds are raising chicks that aren't theirs, which means that that's lost reproductive effort, and they have to feed them, and they'll outcompete the ovenbird's actual offspring. So this nest on the left here has at least 2 cowbirds, and then this chick down at the bottom here is an ovenbird. You can tell because the ovenbird has a yellow gape, so like the area around its mouth, and the cowbirds have pink ones. And I forgot what I was gonna say about them. Oh yeah, so anyways, so that's just kind of a problem for all birds that are the targets of brood parasitism by the cowbirds. And a lot of people ask whether the ovenbirds can just, know that it's not their eggs and remove it. Somebody had even said in the chat, that's what the female ovenbird who kept taking the eye buttons out reminded them of. And basically, once there's 4 or 5 eggs in the nest, they decide that it's just time to incubate. They don't know that they didn't lay those 4 or 5 eggs, so they'll just start incubating them, and then even once the chicks are older, they still just recognize it as, this is a chick that's in my nest, I'm going to feed it and raise it. And the way that forest fragmentation can lead to more cowbirds being near ovenbird nests is that the adult cowbirds prefer like grassier pasture habitats, so that are more open. And so when forest is closer to open habitat like farmland, it's easier for the cowbirds to get in. So for that, we were able to just collect data on whether cowbirds were at the nests or not based on whether there were cowbird chicks or cowbird eggs in the nests. And then the last little bit of my dissertation research that I want to talk about here is the food availability. So ovenbirds forage on the ground, so they'll just go through leaf litter like this type of material and look for any types of insects or other little invertebrates that they can find. So they'll get like a huge mouthful of invertebrates to bring back to the nest. And so we have to have a way to actually measure how much food is on the ground where ovenbirds could find it. And so for that, I collected a whole lot of soda bottles, and people in my department were kind enough to just drop them off in this box for me. And the ones that I really liked the best to make the traps out of were Barq's root beer, because this top is really ideal for what I want to do with them, which is to cut them in half. So then I've got a funnel and a cup basically. And when you put those together, you have a pitfall trap. Because if you bury this in the ground, then like a spider or another little leaf litter invertebrate will just walk along, fall into the little funnel, which is like a little slide then, and be stuck down at the bottom because it can't get back up because of the funnel. So we put these out in all of the forests that we were studying, and we gave them little plastic plate roofs so that rain couldn't get in, and held them up with kebab skewers. So all very technical and scientific. And then every 3 days we would go and check to see what had fallen into the trap so that we knew approximately how many invertebrates were there. And so this is a pretty typical bag of what we would dump out to see what was there. So we've got like a beetle larva here, an isopod, millipede, an ant, some more isopods, there's like a mite, there's probably spiders somewhere in that bag because we get a lot of spiders. And so that's how we measure how much food is available. So that's my dissertation research. And now I'm going to switch gears to the main topic of the night, which is the song of the ovenbird, which I think is some of the most interesting stuff that's come out. So while we're collecting all of this data for the research, we spend a lot of time walking around in the woods. like a lot of time just in the woods. And of course, we have all these great shots of it from collecting mammal data. So it's pretty typical that we're just out in the woods with a big backpack filled with samples and data sheets and material. And we spend a lot of time walking in the woods. Some days are funner than others. This was a rainy day. This is Ben Ranelli, who is an undergrad at UConn, who worked on this project for about 3 years and did some really cool work with how the ovenbirds were bringing food to their chicks. And we spent a lot of time walking through the woods, like a lot of time. Sometimes we had company, so another field tech would come out, but he happened to know exactly where this camera was. And one of the things that happens when you're out in the woods for, 8 hours a day for 3 years with the same people just walking around in the woods collecting data is you start talking about other research ideas. And one of the things that we were talking about happened to be the stock market. Not the actual stock market, but the way that people can model stock market and buyer behaviors. So this is a plot showing the volume of Bitcoin trades over the course of 24 hours. And you can see that there's spikes occasionally, and then just kind of random behavior, and then these spikes. And for the stock market, people are really interested in predicting these types of spikes because it changes buying and selling behavior. And so there's models that people have developed that tell them how to understand what is influencing this behavior that will lead to a spike in buying. And these are Hawk's self-exciting point process models, which you can immediately throw out the back of your mind. They're really cool models. They're the same type of thing that you could use to predict earthquakes. So if you think about it, earthquakes, there's some background probability that an earthquake is going to happen. Like there's just some chance that there will be an earthquake. And if you're on the west, that chance is probably higher than if you're in Minnesota, but there's still just some background chance that there will be an earthquake. But once you have an earthquake, so like right here, we have the main earthquake, the chance that you'll have subsequent earthquakes right after, or the aftershocks, is much higher. So we know that it's not just a constant rate of when earthquakes occur, because once one occurs, there's a higher chance that there will be more. And that's the same type of models that people use for the stock market. And so we were talking about these models during fieldwork because I just think they're really fascinating. And I was telling Ben all about these models, and I was thinking, it would be really interesting if we could apply these to animal behavior. I was saying, yeah, like frogs, they call a lot, and then every once in a while they chorus. So you'll get like these groups of all of the frogs are calling at once. And that's kind of like when there's a spike in Bitcoin trading. And I was saying, yeah, it'd be really cool, but I don't want to learn frog calls. We don't have the data for it. And of course, Ben is a lot more clever than me. And he pointed out that we study ovenbirds and that they're really loud and they call all the time and you get the same kind of patterns. And so somehow I hadn't made this connection that we could also use these models to study ovenbird behavior. And so we talked more about what all the models would be in the interpretation, and we decided to go for it and do this research project. And first we had to figure out, how are we going to interpret the model results in the context of bird behavior? But we know a lot about the reasons why birds sing. So birds sing when they are establishing a territory. The males arrive at the beginning of the breeding season. They want to establish their territory. Once they have a territory, they'll sing to attract a mate. And then they'll also need to defend territorial boundaries. So it's not enough to have just established it once. You need to continue to defend those boundaries, especially if neighbors are encroaching on your territory. Or simply just to respond to neighbors. So if a neighboring male has sung, often you'll hear birds counter sing, partly as a territorial boundary dispute, and sometimes it's just they're in response. Forgot I put all these little bird calls in. And so if you hear that song though, so you're out in the woods and you hear this, you know that the bird is singing, and we know that it's probably singing either to establish a territory, to attract a mate, to defend its territorial boundaries, or to respond to neighbors. But you can't really get that information just from it singing. So you need some other kind of context or behavioral clues to really know what's going on. Except for not if you use those really cool models, because we can separate the song. So in this case, now each song is one of these lines, kind of like an individual earthquake. And so each song we can attribute to whether it's coming from this background rate, or if it's a higher probability because another bird has sung. And we can interpret those differently. So the background rate of singing is like singing to establish a territory or to attract a mate, because the birds are just doing it at some constant background rate. It has nothing to do necessarily with what their neighbors are doing. But once one bird has sung, there's a higher chance that others will respond, and that comes from this higher probability after another bird has sung. So we can use these models to actually pick apart why birds are singing for different reasons. And so we got some really generous funding from the Goldring Family Foundation through Great Hollow Nature Preserve and the Natural Resources Conservation Academy to buy some equipment that would let us record birdsong. So we got these Raspberry Pi computers and some microphones and battery packs that would let us leave the recording units out in the woods. And so we built these and strapped them to trees and then recorded a lot of hours of ovenbirds singing. So that's what the recordings sound like. And you can hear that there's a couple different ovenbirds in there, where there's one that's louder and then one that's a little farther away. And we couldn't distinguish between exact ovenbirds in all the recordings, but we could tell when a new ovenbird initiated a song or began singing. And so these are the units we put up. This is Piper Stepule, who is working on the project. And we loaded all of the recordings that she pulled out of the data and put them into this program, and we listened to it and marked down the time that each bird started singing. And that led to a whole lot of data on how often ovenbirds sing in forests of different sizes. And so this is one of the results. So this is the background rate of singing, which is only for attracting a mate or establishing a territory. It's not responding to neighbors. So basically what we've done is we've removed the response to neighbors from this figure, and we're only looking at attracting a mate or establishing a territory. And then on the x-axis, we have the time in the breeding season. So this is early May, and then this is late June. And as you might expect, the rate of singing goes down across the breeding season. So that means that there's less singing later in the breeding season to attract a mate or establish a territory, and more at the beginning, but there's some variability at the beginning. And that makes sense, because you would think, yeah, early in the breeding season, you have to establish a territory and you have to attract a mate. But later on, if you already have a mate, then you're only going to be singing in response to neighbors. You're not going to try to attract a second mate. And this gets really interesting when we actually look at this, not just as all of our forests combined, but based on the size of the forest. So the green dots here are large forests of like several hundred hectares. The medium ones are more like 70 hectares, and the pink are the small forests, which are probably the worst habitat for ovenbirds based on everything that's in the literature and the other things like more mammals, more brood parasites, and less food. And so this result is really interesting. This is what I'm super excited about, because in the large forest, you can see that there's a really strong decline in the background rate of singing, which means early on, there's a lot of males in the large forests who are singing a lot to establish a territory and to attract a mate. But by the end of the breeding season, they're not singing as much compared to how much they were at the beginning. Whereas in the small forests, it's fairly constant across the breeding season how much the males in small forests are trying to attract a mate. And so if you went out and you did bird surveys only in mid to late June, you would count probably the same number of birds singing in a forest, no matter what size it was. But if you go out early, you would actually be able to distinguish between the good habitat, where there's a lot of males who are singing, who then get paired, versus the poor habitat, where there's not as many males and they aren't actually able to attract a mate by the end of the breeding season. So they're still singing late into the season because there's no females that will settle or build a nest in the small forests. And so I think we need to amend the conspiracy theory model to put this in as a main thing that we should be thinking about when we're looking at how birds respond to forest size. Because the forest size affects territory quality in some way, possibly through all of these different mechanisms, which then affects whether or not there's successful pairings, which changes how often they sing. But since we use singing as a way to measure population size, we really need to think about how we're measuring population size and whether or not singing actually reflects that, and how these two interact. So I made that a dashed line because I don't think that they're as connected as we might think. So I just want to wrap up with a couple of key takeaways. So one, patterns can be misleading. So we have this general pattern that we know that ovenbirds are widely distributed in Connecticut. They appear in almost every block. But we know that the mechanisms matter. So it's not enough just to know that there are ovenbirds present in the size of the forest, because the reproductive success across all of the different sites is not the same. And some of these factors are a lot harder for ovenbirds to deal with in small forests because there's a lot more challenges to having reproductive success. We also know that behavioral observations can help guide conservation, which I think is really cool because I think bird behavior is so interesting. So just from listening to when birds sing and the timing of it, we can get a sense of which habitat is good and which habitat is not. And then another thing people always ask me is about, what conservation actions can individuals do and how can, we contribute to bird conservation on an individual level. And I do think that, individuals can make a difference. It's not like, oh, I can't keep all of the forests in Connecticut from being fragmented, so what can I do? So of course, people can support their local land trusts, parks, and any urban planning policies that would preserve big blocks of continuous forest. So it's really good to have one large forest as opposed to a lot of smaller ones, because the ovenbirds would really need the interior of a large forest to have reproductive success and to have lots of offspring. It's also, really important to obey leash laws and encourage others to as well. Though for those of you who are at Deja's talk last month, it's not always as easy for some people to be able to encourage others to obey leash laws. So it's great if you can, and if you can't, then, it's understandable. We did have quite a few nests that were depredated by I think especially this one off-leash cat that was always in this site got several nests. And then I didn't really talk about this because this happens during the migration time, but avoiding raking leaves in your yard, especially in the fall, is really helpful for songbirds when they're migrating, because leaves, like fallen leaves in the backyard, are a really good place for leaf litter invertebrates and other things like that, that birds need to stock up on and get plenty fat for their migration south if they're migratory. And then, of course, to vote for and support nature-friendly legislators and legislation, because policy can have a big influence on especially land use and how we are setting aside land. And so with that, I'm happy to take any questions. Oh, and this is one of my favorite nests because it had 5 ovenbird chicks, no cowbirds, and they all successfully fledged. But yeah, so I'd be happy to take any questions.
Hi, thank you, Eliza. That was great. I'm going to read questions out of the chat room, so you don't have to worry about that. I thought that talk was fascinating, and forest birds are something that I've been interested in a long time in Connecticut. I originally got interested in conservation because of grassland birds in Connecticut, and the thing about grassland birds is they need a minimum size area. Grasshopper sparrow needs around 30 acres. Upland sandpiper needs around 200 acres. You generally think of Connecticut as this big forest of a state, and you don't worry so much about the wood thrushes or the ovenbirds until you start looking at the trends of the forest interior habitat. And I really liked that slide you had in there that showed 1985 to 2002, was it? You know, the loss of interior habitat at a time when our forest habitat has been increasing since World War II. The interior forest has been decreasing. So you can develop a 1 acre parcel and it can end up fragmenting, you know, 100 acre, depending on how you measure the fragmentation effect. So ironically, even though in a sense it's our most common habitat type, in the longer run, I think ovenbird and other forest birds are maybe one of the most vexing conservation issues that we're dealing with in the state, because instead of 200 to 400 acres for an upland sandpiper, you're talking 2,000 to 20,000 acre blocks that we need to protect and coordinate management on. And a lot of that is private land. About 70% of our forests in Connecticut are private land. We do have, you know, I loved your suggestions as to how people can help. We also have a similar graphic on our website that you can, if you scroll back in the what's new long enough, you can find it. Maybe we'll post it again on our social media. But a lot of the same things that you had in there, we ended up on things you can do to help birds as an individual. And I thought your list was very very good. So scrolling back quite a ways, there's a few comments. Somebody had, can we go back to the first ovenbird nest? It was right before the viburnum understory, I think. Somebody was at, you know, somebody wanted to point out all the invasives.
Yeah, this gotta go all the way back to Amanda's nest here. Yeah, this site is in
Barberry.
Storrs, Connecticut, right by the University of Connecticut, and yeah, there was a big barberry removal project going on when we were there.
Interesting. Did you notice an impact on the ovenbird populations after the barberry was removed?
So what was really kind of odd is the ovenbirds don't seem to mind the barberry,
right,
because for them it's more understory vegetation. We even had one of the nests the first year of my field season was underneath barberry, and it was successful. It fledged several ovenbird chicks. So.
Yeah, no, we've noticed in some other studies that when barberry is removed, it's removing structure. Obviously, there are some really bad things about barberry. It's invasive. It can cause erosion, increase in ticks and whatever. But it's interesting that some birds are adapted to using invasives. So someone also made a comment about the next nest, which was the nice viburnum understory, which we noticed there isn't much of in this. So it's a pretty contrast, and I bet you there's a lot more deer in site 1 than site 2. Yeah,
and that was some of the sites where we just couldn't even find nests really were the sites where there was a lot of deer, because they browse all the understory, and then there's no like understory vegetation like this to actually put a nest under. So.
Yeah, no, deer are a vexing problem in forest. Deer overabundance is a vexing problem in forest conservation. Probably the second. Yeah, there's invasive species, there's fragmentation, and then there's overabundant deer and pests and pathogens. Lots of issues facing our forests and forest birds. Has there been any correlation in productivity or abundance, and this ties into our what we've already been talking about, in non-native versus non-native invasive versus native cover in the under to mid-story?
Yeah, we had so few nests that were actually in invasive vegetation cover that we can't actually tell for sure, because it's such a small sample size. It's, I think it's one in the barberry versus everything else was in more like non-invasive habitat. So yeah, I can't say for sure because our one sample point in barberry was a success, but we don't actually know. That's something where I wish we had enough, differences in the nests and the data to actually be able to tell.
Great. Yeah, no, I've been involved in some forest bird modeling projects, some of the early ones with Chris Field back, long time ago. And we did find it fairly difficult to predict what factors were going to make the birds more abundant or less abundant, other than forest block size, which seemed to be a fairly effective predictor.
Yeah.
The one factor I'm always curious about is, did you at all look at it at landscape forest cover? I think that forested landscapes are important for birds, and there's some evidence that show that once a landscape gets below 70% forest cover at the 1 kilometer scale, it becomes very unhelpful for forest birds. Between 70 and 80%, it starts to be good habitat, and then 80+% appears to be prime habitat for forest interior birds. Did you find any of that in your research?
Yeah, so well, I still have to run the models with like the landscape level variables, but one of the things that was actually kind of challenging with this is that all of our data comes from sites that are within a similar area of Connecticut. So it's all mostly forest. And so the differences between two sites is usually just based on edges or development that are leading them to be smaller fragments. So like I even had two, which I think is actually one of my, nope, it's back farther. These two sites right here are across the road from each other. So they're like, it's the exact same proportion of forest in the landscape, and one of them was just a lot smaller than the other, and so there was way fewer birds there. So yeah, it's one of those things where it's definitely true, especially in other sites where people have looked at ovenbirds a lot in like Missouri and Pennsylvania. They are, talking about the same kind of thresholds in landscape forest cover. But with all of my sites so close to each other, they all pretty much share the same amount of forest around them.
Great. I'm going to refrain from more questions from now until we get through all these. Kathy, our board chair, made a comment that Chad Seawagon is doing research on the effect of barberry on ovenbirds reproduction at next to Deer Pond Farm. How large is a large forest, Tom Anderson asks, in your opinion?
Yeah, that's a good question. The largest ones that we were in were like 1,000 hectares. Some of them were up to like 3,000 hectares. But it kind of seems like as soon as you're up in more than, 50 or 60 hectares, that seemed sufficient. It was really only the ones that were smaller than that were not great habitat. But the bigger the better. So this one right here, this is Nyholman State Forest, and it's huge. So
can you remind us how many acres per hectare?
That's a really good question. I don't actually know off the top of my head.
Yeah, I don't know anymore either. I used to know the answer to that. Maybe somebody can put it in chat for us. I don't have time to Google it. Yeah, I'm a little rusty on hectares versus acres. Someone mentioned that they can't tell the difference between Carolina wren and ovenbird. I assume they mean the songs. They can be very similar. I often say you listen to the instrument that the bird is playing in addition to the song that it's playing. Like a pine warbler plays, it's the same song as a junco, but they both play on a different instrument. And I think that ovenbirds and Carolina wrens both have a teacher call, but the totally different sounding instruments they're playing it on. Maybe you have some insight as well.
Yeah, I always think of Carolina wrens as almost like rolling. Like they seem like they're doing kind of a like continuous rolling call. Like it could start over, and the ovenbirds are more like jabbing. I don't know if that helps or not.
Another thing I found with ovenbirds is they tend to get louder in the middle of their song. They get louder in the middle and then trail off. And actually, that's a good way to identify pine warblers versus, say, chipping sparrow.
Mhm.
So yeah, there are no leash laws for cats, unfortunately. That was just a comment. And I'm not sure, Jim Aragoni asked, how did you come to select tribal lands for study sites? How do they compare with state forests and private forests? I think maybe you were just saying the historic tribal land.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. I just wanted to make sure to acknowledge the historic land and yeah. So these were mostly state forests and public lands, but on occupied lands.
Right. Yeah. That is a new thing with a lot of presentations is land acknowledgements to acknowledge, you know, the land in which you know, where you're located, where you're doing your work, etc. Acknowledging which tribes used to be there. Brian McCarthy says, well done, Eliza. Why do ovenbirds nest on the ground instead of trees or bushes like most other birds? Kirby asks.
That's a good question. Yeah, I guess I've never really looked into the evolutionary history of how they became ground nesters. I mean, with all birds, they're competing with both within the species and then with other species for resources and, you know, somewhere that they can actually build the nest, and that's just their reproductive strategy. It would be really interesting though to we could get a time machine and go back in time and trace the evolutionary history of how they became ground nesters.
Great. No, that would be awesome. I've often wanted to go get in a time machine and see the different habitat states of New England at that time. Steve Broker said in the Connecticut Breeding Bird Atlas 1982 to 1986, George Clark cited a Canadian study of ovenbirds that indicated ovenbirds ranged extensively outside of their song territories, and that such foraging areas were also used by birds coming from other song territories, so shared foraging territories. George asked whether measurements of territorial size determined from the song perches of males might give overestimates of the number of birds that can breed in a forest tract. Any comments on that?
Yeah, because that's one of the big problems that everybody who studies like territorial birds faces is, you know, like you're saying, we usually measure where the song perches are and use that as the extent of the territory, but we know that that's the area that they'll defend, but they have a much larger home range, which is, yeah, where they'll go forage or, you know, do whatever birds are doing throughout the day. And they'll also sneak into other males' territories. So there's a lot of people who are researching these days extra pair copulation, where essentially, you know, one male ovenbird will sneak into another male's territory or find a female who is paired with a male from another territory. And so not all of the eggs in an ovenbird's nest, well, they're usually all of the females. We don't know about any brood parasitism within ovenbirds, but they're not all necessarily fertilized by the male whose territory it is. So we can't get a great estimate of population size from territories. We also know that there's a lot of birds who don't have a territory, and they're called like floater males usually, who just kind of sneak around into other males' territories or pretend to be a female, but don't actually have a territory themselves. So yeah, it's not a great estimate of abundance, but we don't really know a better way to do it other than really expensive things like putting a tracker on every individual bird. So.
Great. There's some kudos here. Debbie Deegan said an excellent presentation, fascinating information. It was very interesting. Tom Anderson put a link to the 10 actions you can take to help Connecticut birds in the chat section. The chat will be recorded along with the presentation, will be available. Stefan was commenting on that viburnum understory again. He's really impressed with it, with all the native plants there. Susan Favreau said, great presentation, thank you. Robert Buck, thank you for a most interesting presentation. 2.5, thank you, Tom. 2.5 acres roughly per hectare. So double and a little bit to make that conversion. 3 Carolina wren has a 3-syllable versus the 2-syllable of the ovenbird. Yes, in the typical songs, that's true. They do the tea kettle, tea kettle, tea kettle, or cheeseburger, cheeseburger, cheeseburger. But Carolina wrens will sing a 2-noted song as well. Thank you from Randall White. Jim, thank you for clarifying about the tribal. All right, have you ever seen an ovenbird at a backyard feeder? From Randall White.
I have not.
I have not, but I've seen photos of it, and actually, often there's been a couple of ovenbirds seen on Christmas bird counts in recent years, and they've been at feeders.
That's interesting. Yeah, because I just can't even imagine them eating seeds, but I suppose, especially if it's Christmas bird count and it's that late, that there's not as many invertebrates to eat, so.
Yeah, and it's amazing that they're that cold hardy. You know,
Yeah.
you always think of warblers as these gentle flowers. Well, I mean, hummingbirds can be cold hardy, so. People apologizing they have to leave, thanking you, great presentation. Mary Pelletier says, successful high-density urban suburban residential neighborhoods are important for reducing sprawl. Successful urban neighborhoods need access to healthy nature, urban wilds that are conserved from the development. Absolutely, we do need urban green spaces. Just in Hartford, there's Keeney Park, which is loaded with ovenbirds and wood thrushes. New Haven's got West Rock and East Rock parks, which are both loaded with ovenbirds. Bridgeport has some areas that like Success area where there's probably nesting ovenbirds as well. So even in our most urban areas, we will get ovenbirds, at least calling. And you did make that good, important distinction that there's not necessarily a correlation between calling and successful nesting, and in fact, it may be inverse, and it may just be the loser males that sing more often than the ones that picked a good territory.
Yep.
And I believe that is all of the questions we have right now. I want to thank all of you who are Connecticut Audubon Society members. 2020 was an amazing year for the Connecticut Audubon Society, and we wouldn't be able to do it without you all. Our members, our volunteers, I saw a couple of state board members in here, our staff, everybody really pulled together to make 2020 an amazing year for conservation in Connecticut, despite all the challenges we faced. So I just want to thank you all for the roles that you've played in that. I want to thank Eliza for this wonderful presentation. I want to thank Planet Fuel for their support of the Young Gifted and Wild About Birds series. Our next one will be Dennis Liu, which I believe is, hold on, it's January 28th at 7 p.m. And he will be talking about the Half Earth and All the Hummingbirds project. He is Vice President of Education from the E.O. Wilson Foundation's Half Earth project. If you don't have all of your tickets to the series yet, we have Miramar Gutierrez Ramirez talking about the ordeal of bird migration on February 18th. This is going to be a very popular one, Bird Names for Birds with Jordan Rudder and Gabriel Foley on Tuesday, March 16th at 7 p.m. And wrapping it up will be Dr. Desiree Narango on Wednesday, April 21st, 2021 at 7 p.m. Unless any other staff have some words they want to put in, we'll bid you all a good night and thank you for participating.